Morning, everyone. Thank you for sharing your time with me this day. My name is Albert Del Pilar, Managing Director with Richard Joseph, investment bank based out of St. Louis, Missouri. My goal today is to share my experience with you all and some suggestions on how Board of Directors and members of management can deal with unsolicited offers, unsolicited purchase offers in the context of ESOPs. All right. Okay, moving forward, here's a little bit about me today, some context as to who's doing the talking. Just some background here, summary. I think this really serves to remind me that 1997 was a long, long time ago. But seriously, I am hoping that my years of experience in investment banking today will help some or all of you in dealing with this particular issue. And so with that, I thank you again for joining this morning. A little bit about our firm. In summary, we were founded in 2010. We are 18 professionals, mostly based in St. Louis, Missouri. We advise boards of directors and management teams and business owners in a variety of ways as it relates to finance and M&A. Most of what we do involves an ESOP in some way, shape, or form. We advise companies along the entire ESOP corporate life cycle. All right. So today's goals is to be, in fact, better prepared, hopefully, for unsolicited purchase offers. So what does being better prepared mean? I hope that it will mean that at the end of this presentation, you'll understand kind of your basic responsibilities and perhaps those of your colleagues that are related or have responsibilities with regard to reviewing offers, and as well as basically kind of understanding when, what, and when have you basically constituted or fulfilled your basic responsibilities. I will say I'm not a lawyer, I'm an investment banker. So this presentation is focused on process, information, and the use of information to make decisions, a decision, and that is whether or not to obtain an unsolicited offer. So hopefully at the end of the day, this presentation just following up, and I guess just going over what might constitute being prepared in this context based on our experience, really would constitute basically the items on the left-hand side. So do you have written policies and procedures in place to which you can refer once an unsolicited offer comes in? I'd say in many ways, if you're not looking to sell, has the board memorialized objectives related to maintaining ESOP ownership? So in some kind of core document, is that mission, is that intent documented? The third point here, is there a process that is reasonably consistent when offers do come in, or can be consistent when offers do come in? And then, as you'll see later on in the presentation, the definition of what is a bona fide offer is important in this situation. And so part of the definition of being prepared is to kind of having an internal definition of what is a bona fide offer as far as the board or the management team is concerned. And then the last here is if the company has an awareness of fair market value, perhaps both through the ESOP valuation and in some other form, is that in place? So basically, if you have the things on the left-hand side covered, or can you respond to those in the affirmative in some way, you've covered about 85 to 90% of what likely needs to be done when an unsolicited offer comes in. And so as we progress, you'll notice that we will emphasize process, benchmarking, documentation, and deliberation, all of these items related to the left-hand side of the page. The right-hand side basically is not so much about what is bad, but it would point out or highlight some of the reasons why you would want to kind of have a framework in place once an unsolicited offer comes in. What constitutes an offer? So in order to deal with an offer, you got to kind of understand and identify and define what an offer is. So an offer, generally speaking, might be a kind of a verbal, informal, formal inquiry, an indication of interest, non-binding in every way, or a letter of intent, and as well as obviously a definitive agreement. A definitive agreement, generally in context wouldn't just appear out of the blue. It would involve the seller somewhat, but these are generally definitions of what an offer might look like, or what might encapsulate an offer. The key question here, or the consideration is, of these types of offers or solicitations, do they all deserve the same level of response? And I think the answer there is no. As you can imagine, an inquiry from a partner at a large, well-known private equity firm, or a director of a corporate or strategic development department of a major company would carry much more weight than in just a general inquiry, or even an IOI from, let's say, what's popularly referred to as an independent sponsor, someone who doesn't have committed capital, but it's out there inquiring as to the possibility of a company being up for sale. So nonetheless, common sense can help guide folks to understand when an offer is kind of real, has the potential or not, and we'll go kind of through those factors. But the takeaway is that if an offer kind of feels and looks like it's real, the folks that are putting it forward have some basis, have the wherewithal, are known to be acquirers, and then you should take it seriously in as much as you should investigate the merit and kind of flesh it out if possible, but you don't necessarily need to commit yourself to any particular process or any particular party. The takeaway here, I think, is that boards do have a duty to shareholders to investigate the merits of each proposal and make a determination based on a business judgment, and kind of just not leave it hanging, but close it out, right, in some way. All right, so we've talked about what constitutes an offer. At the core of that is, identifying what a bona fide offer is. And generally speaking, bona fide offers are nominally adequate, have some deal terms that are fair and reasonable, treat all shareholders equitable, and are coming from a potential buyer that has or is known to have the financial ability to pay the proposed purchase price. So, one question that might arise here for folks and kind of trying to determine what a bona fide offer is, it would be, if there's an interested party that's generally known to be able to purchase a sizable company but doesn't put forward very specific deal terms or proposed purchase price, is it your job, is it my job to flesh out the offer until I can determine whether all three factors here listed are met? I think the answer here is no. Boards have a duty to investigate merit, but they don't necessarily have a duty to negotiate. And so if the offer comes in a certain shape or form, you can kind of ask some clarifying questions, but you don't necessarily need to engage or provide information. And you certainly don't need to start negotiating if the offer is put forward. I think just generally speaking, again, the board has a duty to investigate the merits of the offers. A trustee, an ESOP trustee, has a duty to investigate if a deal is ultimately in the best interest of a plan participant or participants. And again, you can try to flesh out and establish if it's a bona fide offer or not, but you don't have the duty necessarily to negotiate. All right, so getting to the heart of the matter here, what happens after you get an unsolicited offer? These are 5 steps that can be taken after receiving that offer. The first, some folks can ignore it or choose to ignore it. However, there are offers that come in that are too good to refuse, and again, should be investigated further. You do want to, before kind of effectively ignoring it or setting it aside, you do want to perhaps ask some clarifying questions. If there's an inkling if the offer is bona fide. And remember, you can ask some clarifying questions, but you don't need to share any information. You can instead focus on gathering what other outlines of the offer might be available in the exchange or through the exchange. It's a general understanding that when it comes to considering an offer, there should be a plan as to, which members of the board or which members of the management team should confer on inbound offers. There should be a plan to reference that lays out how to proceed in evaluating the situation, and also how to close out the process, the consideration process, as it relates to number 2. Members of management might ask themselves, at what point, should I or should we inform the board of directors? And again, it goes to if it seems to be legitimate, possible, consistent, perhaps with the greater strategic plan that is known to have been being discussed or put in place by the board, by the members of the board. Then certain of the members, if there are committees in place, should be made aware of these offers, and the receipt of the offers should be documented. Again, when considering an offer, the board would make sure that that the process is documented. There's a reference point with regard to some kind of strategic plan, and that there is a context, basically, in which any and all these offers, whether determined, deemed to be legitimate or not, can be analyzed or investigated or looked into. So with regard to the board basically coming into a decision saying, okay, we have an offer in front of us. It seems to be legitimate. Do we have a duty, after fleshing it out somewhat, to inform the trustee? That is, in fact, true. Generally speaking, when boards come across an offer that seems to merit the investigation or looking into, they need to pass on any of those legitimate offers to the ESOP fiduciary to review. So in that context, it would be advisable to be prepared with written analysis and discussion of the offer in question or offers in question if there's an intent to inform the trustee. Generally speaking, these materials should reference, like I said before, some kind of guiding framework. Generally speaking, that might be a strategic plan, might be the ESOP plan document, might be some benchmark analysis of the status quo that the management team has put in place with regard to future prospects or growth. There should be some materials or some analysis related to alternatives that might get the company to the kind of the same result from a value realization standpoint that a sale might lead to. And again, all of these considerations, all this analysis and discussion should be informed by market data. Again, this is not easy. It's not easy per se, but it's involved. It's an involved process dealing with offers or developing a framework to deal with offers and running through that process. So oftentimes internal resources aren't necessarily committed to that process, and perhaps they should be committed. Consider setting up some kind of committees. But also you might consider having advisors such as an investment banker that can help a board on a regular basis either prepare and assess or articulate a strategic plan, or develop or articulate a particular strategy or intent relating to M&A generally, and or inform the board about market trends with regard to acquisitions or sales or valuations of comparable companies out there. All right. I think whatever process is developed that suits the company, it should be documented. I think any and all exchanges, deliberations should be documented, and more specifically, I think one should document how the situation, the deliberation was closed out. So you could just making sure that loose threads aren't left out there hanging, or inquiries are kind of left out there and no resolution to a process can be found. All right, so some key organizing questions to help folks put in a framework for dealing with unsolicited offers. you can basically begin with identifying who typically or has in the past or might be expected to receive the offer, and identify of those who might be recipients of unsolicited offers. Are they conflicted in any way? Is the conflict known? And is there a process in which when the offer comes in, it can be documented and it can be shared? The inbound offer can be shared with someone else, some other parties that might be responsible for the governance of the business. All right, so the second question would be, who decides if the company is to be sold? Again, identifying those individuals, their perspective, their concerns, it's helpful in figuring out who that initial review team might be, what information they need, what their processes are for recognizing an offer is under consideration, and how to close that out. Third question that would help develop a framework is, who's responsible ultimately for the negotiating the offer? It's a tricky question. I mean, I think the other question that comes out is how much negotiation can or should take place before elevating the offer to those individuals who actually decide if the company is sold. But when you identify who the folks who are responsible for negotiating the offer are and who actually decides, as you'll see later in the slides, there are specific concerns and considerations that these individuals in certain roles have. And so any framework, any analysis, any discussion should reference those things that are either drivers or duties that are known to those parties. Another question that comes up often with regard to dealing with unsolicited offers, and if you actually engage in any type of conversation with that potential suitor, is whether or not just having a dialogue or opening a dialogue informally puts the company in play, or formally. And the answer to that is no. The decision to put a company in play or to initiate a sale offer is a deliberate decision that can be put into action by the board in a formal manner. So informal kind of exchanges, communications with a potential suitor doesn't automatically put you in play. So there are some issues here that folks might have identified already with regard to unsolicited offers. The concerns that arise generally with regard to these type of offers is the fact that they come up generally in the absence of a process. So there wasn't any type of auction process. There's no context really, or market context for price, terms and conditions for that offer. And so the questions that arise at this point, do we shop this if in fact it's interesting and the potential to sell a business kind of aligns with strategic plan? So do we shop this offer we have in front of us? Can we shop this? How should we shop the offer? You don't necessarily have to. Again, I said that before. You don't necessarily have to negotiate as well, but if you are going to have some kind of back and forth, again, any exchanges, as little or small, should be documented in some way, shape, or form so that the board and the trustee, as it relates to process, can get as much credit as possible when folks might come around in hindsight and try to examine whether or not the right things or the right steps were taken in accepting or rejecting an offer. Let's see, the other issue that arises with unsolicited offers is kind of assessing where that offer sits in the context of fair market value. So headline price might be attractive in a particular offer, but it may not be necessarily fair to the ESOP when all factors are weighed, or the economics, or the maybe items such as internal loans or the mix of allocated, unallocated shares are factored into the end result for the ESOP given a particular headline purchase price. With regard to price itself, in an unsolicited offer, that also poses a problem unless the folks who are reviewing the offer and the board understand whether The current ESOP valuation is reflective of market trends, and that understanding would be based on regular analysis or review of market multiples for publicly traded comparables, or market multiples for precedent transactions. And then there's the instance where one might actually review some control premium studies and just have general market data, so that if an offer comes in unsolicited and there is somewhere to turn to establish whether we're dealing with an attractive price from a legitimate potential acquirer. Let's see. And the last point here, some other questions. Some folks think about, okay, well, how, if I get an offer coming in, does that affect, or should it affect how I manage my ESOP for that particular, during that particular time? I think that's, for the context of this conversation, that's a lower priority item, and so I won't really address it there. I'm really addressing kind of what things should be in place, how to contextualize, and how to process an unsolicited offer. Let's see. All right. So the players in this context are the board of directors and the ESOP trustees or any other fiduciaries. There are conflicts to consider in this situation. I think all parties here have a duty to act in good faith, a duty to be loyal, a duty to be prudent. For boards of directors dealing with unsolicited purchase offers, if there's a strategic plan in place that makes it much easier for the board to carry out its duties and feel comfortable in that it did the right thing with a particular offer in a particular situations, the boards can choose to run types of processes they deem are best for their company with regard to addressing issues such as maximizing value for shareholders or protecting market share or trade secrets. The ESOP, on the other hand, has very explicit duties. It has to actually obviously act in those manners consistent with those three items I laid out before. But any and all offers must be viewed through the lens of what is exclusively in the best interest of the ESOP participants, and then that could create a kind of a divergence for the board of directors in contexts where there's more than one type of shareholder, where the ESOP is not maybe the controlling shareholder or the sole shareholder. I think the takeaway here is that these parties have their requirements that both of these kind of parties have in these situations. The law requires the fiduciaries to accept any offer that significantly enhances the long-term value of plan assets. Conversely, you can say that it also allows fiduciaries to reject offers if they conclude that the status quo is also or is better over the long term for the interest of the plan participants. But these conflicts should be kept in mind, and they should be identified for these parties. And any information, any documentation, analysis, deliberation should reference these duties and these concerns and how the conversations and determinations fulfill those obligations or responsibilities. So a quick look at some of the things that guide board of directors. Again, these are just high level. These are based in regulation, based in law. Obviously lawyers and legal counsel are kind of the best source for understanding the greater nuances of all these or of these attributes or these considerations and kind of the history behind them. But they serve here to listing them here serves to give folks a sense of what type of topical areas should be addressed in perhaps a checklist or a plan that might be put in place to respond to offers consistently. I put here at the end, just for discussion purposes, whether or not, the question as to whether or not an auction is required if a company decides to negotiate a transaction. Can you go exclusive, let's say, said another way, can you go exclusive with a particular party without an auction process? And the answer to that is yes. There are ways. There have been instances where trustees have gotten comfortable with going down a particular, going down an acquisition path or sale path with a particular acquirer without having gone through an auction process. In those instances, primarily, are cases where a broader process could potentially harm or expose trade secrets to the marketplace, or perhaps there are concerns related to the amount of information that could be or need to be shared during a diligence process, and whether or not the existence of such a process might negatively impact customers or vendor relationships, both through rumors or through the potential to have a change in ownership. Following are some items that the ESOP trustee considers, or standards to which a trustee is held. Again, acting in good faith, they're expected to undertake diligent investigation, act with independent judgment, kind of do the things and ask the questions and run a process that would be consistent with what a prudent expert might undertake. There's a fair amount of rulings and regulation and comment and discussion around these regulations that exist there. We put them up here for reference. Again, the purpose of laying out these considerations, these concerns, is to help folks realize or to think about the framework, all the questions and the checklists and the processes that they should undertake when an offer comes in, because there are different parties with different interests and concerns. And the more, let's say, in place, or kind of the more organized the process is, the better when it's examined in hindsight. All right. So as it relates to the ESOP trustee, again, just expanding on some of these things, these are some of the questions that a trustee will pose in its review of a particular offer, or whether or not to consider going down the path with a particular party. Include some of these questions here. Was there a thorough process used to reach this proposed transaction? So that includes both engaging in whether or not multiple parties or potential suitors were engaged. Was there a thorough, was there a kind of a thorough consideration of alternatives? Were key factors of the proposed transaction negotiated effectively or extensively? If there's a transaction in front of the trustee to be considered, what is the relative fairness of that transaction? That is, if there are more than one party, perhaps a more type of shareholders, or does it treat the ESOP participants, the shareholders in that context, as well as perhaps non-ESOP shareholders? Is the buyer the best partner for their business at this point in time? And this is a challenging, assessing that it can be challenging because there's obviously more than one partner out there potentially based on varying strategic opportunities that might emerge from certain of these business combinations. So I think that question can be, in terms of getting an answer for that question, can be aided really through a strategic plan that has, a context or a definition for what the objective of the company is in terms of with regard to market share, their position relative to competitors, their position in the capital markets, and whether or not any of the larger grand strategic goals that the company has put in place can be achieved on their own, or if there are any number of partners that offer better odds, better chances of achieving those objectives and creating shareholder value over the long run. The last factor here is the absolute fairness of the offer, and that's basically, just referencing fair market value. Is it above? How much above? Is it what does the market say about this particular offer when compared with publicly available information? I think the better the board's work in terms of incorporating data analysis that is relevant to the ESOP trustee when considering offers, the quicker a determination can be made as to the attractiveness of a particular offer. So the next slide here really talks about just some key questions that typically emerge in hindsight when a process is examined. And so these should help folks kind of frame create the structure that they want to process these offers. You don't want to just be in a reactive position per se. That is, get an offer and all of a sudden kind of scramble and have to put all the framework in place to figure out, okay, does the offer in front of us address the concerns of the board with regard to the strategic plan? Do we know whether do we have to go out there and quickly figure out what the market is like for our types of companies, or have we been tracking? Do we have context for the current valuation versus historical valuations? Did the board have effective advisors during their process or during the consideration or deliberation of an unsolicited offer? Was there an auction? Again, it's not necessary, but there should be whatever framework is in place should address why or why not the particular type of auction, whether it's a narrow or broad action, is good or bad for, or what the pros and cons are of particular processes with regard to exploring a potential sale. Having those concerns listed in some kind of policy material is really helpful when a process is looked at in hindsight. There are some other things that relate that kind of come into looking at whether a sale process had some inherent flaws in it, and they tend to deal with motivations of folks and rewards that might be out there for an investment banker to get a deal done. So often people ask, was the contract with the investment bankers structured, such that success is determined by a closed deal because the banker would get paid on the closed deal, and so was in fact the driving imperative behind pursuing a sale the best possible deal for the company, or is it just getting a deal done? And who are the folks making the decision, and what kind of motivations did they have in getting that deal done? So that goes to working to identify the folks who should review these opportunities and what conflicts they may have inherently or explicitly or implicitly. I think with regard to a process, just in avoiding Monday morning quarterbacking or hindsight's 2020, I think creating a checklist around some of the issues we've covered so far, and some a checklist that's based on answering some of these questions would be really helpful to have in place. So some of the questions related to assessing the acquirer that's put forward an unsolicited offer are the following. Is the buyer a known acquirer? And is there any context for their success in acquiring business and integrating those businesses? Are there synergies that can be identified that might result from a potential combination, and have those synergies been factored into the value or the purchase price that has been put forward and the deal and the terms and conditions of the offer? Is there a sense that the benefit of the combination also may accrue in the future to the sellers? Let's see. I think, with regard to the potential acquirer, and just kind of assessing, their suitability and the wherewithal that they might have to kind of execute on a deal, if in fact, the company's in a position or deems an offer worthy of being investigated. The key decision there is how much and whether or in how much information to share with these suitors and at what point. I think there is merit to having a certain amount of information that can be shared with potential suitors that would be helpful in those suitors' assessment of performance. It doesn't have to be public information. It doesn't have to be like confidential operating information. It could be benchmarking information that perhaps positions that shows the company performance based on some industry accepted metrics relative to the peer group. So having the ability to engage a potential acquirer and kind of by providing some information, not too sensitive, but effective enough or meaningful enough so that the acquirer can put out or at least provide information that allows the board or management team or the sub-trustee to figure out whether they should, how they should proceed with a particular offer and what determination they might ultimately come to a situation. I've listed in the next couple slides, again, just a number of issues that that are known to inform or to concern ESOP trustees. I won't dive too much into them, but the takeaway here is that trustees have very explicit duties in terms of investigating and contemplating or considering potential offers, but they don't have to necessarily act solely on value. They can look at other factors and look at the long-term versus the short-term potential benefits of any given series of actions that the board or the company or the trustee might take. So again, next slide here, some other questions that come up when folks are trying to figure out how to act or what to do when an offer comes in and who to talk to and what the concerns are and what should be discussed and what should be laid out. So these are just provided for background. So in the first point, yes, trustee can take into consideration other non-financial factors. Again, mostly tied to the long-term benefit of the plan participants. Can the ESOP trustee agree to an earnout? The answer to that is generally yes, but the second question here I think is more relevant. Can an earnout or escrow funds be considered part of a purchase price? And the answer to that is no, in our experience. And at least it's our experience is that trustees will look at the particular offer through the lens of what the ESOP receives at basically at closing and what they get and how they get it. The last point here really relates to kind of the factors around employee voting and when you get down the line, at what point do you put it to participants to vote on a particular transaction matter? And while the regulations say one thing with regard to stock sales and asset sales, usually what you find is that most folks, when proceeding down a process for a sale process, will ultimately look to provide the opportunity to participants to vote on the matter as part of just basically being more thorough in their process and being able to stand up against scrutiny post-transaction. So here, I think this last slide, just coming towards the end, but here's what an optimal ESOP company sale process would generally look like. So I put this up here to help folks think about, well, how can I be prepared for each of these segments of an optimal sale process now, even though I might not be interested in selling my business? Your first unsolicited offer, basically, if you haven't had one or expect to get one, can be useful in creating the foundation for this type of process to potentially play out sometime in the future. I think it's prudent to be prepared because ESOP-owned companies are on the radar of many acquirers, particularly the private equity community. And so when you're going to get any number of parties or private equity firms approaching companies in different ways, and the better prepared you are in your deliberation process, your framework for consideration, that then kind of allows you to undertake this type of process when you do embark upon a sale process, the better. I think, I've said it before, I'll say it again, any framework that should be put in place, or that is put in place to help consider any and all offers that might come in, should be informed by, I believe, should be informed by the following question. That is, what is the strategic imperative for the board and the company as it relates to remaining a going concern? So if you can answer that question and the imperative is identified, the strategy is put in place, the tactics to meet that imperative are laid out, and anything in the checklist to benchmark any particular offer that might, either help you get to towards your, help you achieve your strategic imperative, or may seemingly deviate from it, can be in fact, incorporated or referenced or considered in the context of a larger macro strategic plan the company has in place that just relates to being a business, staying a business, being competitive, keeping its market share and growing its market share. So some concluding observations here. Every ESOP company should have a policy to address a potential sale of the company. They should just be a plan, and it should be founded in the overall corporate strategic plan. There should be a portion of that plan that establishes a position of the board on M&A and growth, both buying and selling. There should be some articulation as to what the plan in place currently in terms of operating and remaining a going concern says about the role of a merger or an acquisition or sale might be in meeting the goals that have been laid out. So some of the things that can help can inform that plan or can be part of that plan. Well, companies should follow their comps. Companies, they should know who their comparable companies are. Usually those can be found in ESOP valuation reports. There may be other companies that are not in the valuation report that management deems kind of more meaningful. So those comps should be followed, should be tracked regularly. You should know the market, so you should be able to contextualize your particular sector, your particular point in the value chain against kind of the broader market and how you're performing. Is there a tailwind? Is there a headwind? Are you consistent? Is there correlation with the broader market? You should keep track of how things are going. There should be a base measure as part of this plan of relative return for stakeholders and shareholders. And that base measure is important because any offer needs to be compared to something. So if you can identify some metrics, some things that are important to the stakeholders and to the shareholders, and have that in place, and you have those measurements, they've been quantified, and when an offer comes in, you can check and you undertake some analysis as it relates to the qualitative outputs or implications of a particular offer. You can check those estimates against your benchmark. You should know your employee demographics if you're an ESOP company, because oftentimes repurchase obligations are the primary motivating factor for these ESOP-owned companies to explore a potential sale. They get caught often, maturing ESOP companies get caught often between increasing repurchase obligations due to underlying ESOP participant demographics and changes in the competitive landscape and needs to respond to market dynamics and use of cash. And so you have this conflict between where you have this tension in identifying what is the highest and best use of the cash the business is generating. So to the extent that you are keeping track or understand your employee demographics, you can look forward through repurchase obligation studies and then incorporate that into a strategic plan and know when capital requirements will be a big part of executing on the strategic plan, and when repurchase obligations might conflict with those plans is really helpful, because you don't want to be caught flat-footed in a situation and kind of forced to basically look to a third party, an outside suitor to alleviate the situation or to remedy the situation with regard to cash, the use of cash. Regardless of the framework and the process that a company might customize or create specifically to their own situation, understanding that conflict should be avoided is incredibly important. And it's just not only should they be avoided, but they should be identified first, obviously, and then the measures taken to avoid those conflicts or to address those conflicts should be documented as well. So how can you mitigate kind of the accusation that an offer was viewed through conflicted lens? Well, you can just make sure that the process is well documented. So documenting the receipt of the offer, documenting the nature of the offer, establishing who absolutely needs to know about the offer, and identifying the information that they will need that will be of the most interest to those folks responsible for ultimately making decisions, gathering and analyzing that information, whatever it might be, for discussion, and then documenting and summarizing all the considerations and deliberations with regard to these offers on a regular basis. And I will pause there and see if that's the end. I'll see if there are any questions from the audience.
Okay, and we do have some questions. I'm gonna go jump around a little bit. Forgive me if you've addressed some of these in your presentation already. One is, must an offer be in writing to be considered quote unquote real or quote unquote bona fide?
I think the answer to that is yes. Ultimately, the transaction documents are numerous and complex and detailed and nuanced, and there are lots in terms of conditions that are ultimately end up having to be negotiated. And a bona fide offer will address at least the very, very high level, or at least address at a high level, kind of the most critical elements of getting a deal done. And so my answer to that is yes.
Great. This is a little bit about the process. How does the decision maker evaluate qualitative aspects of the offer? For example, if required, what's the probability that the jobs stay in the community that the ESOP currently operates, etc.?
It is totally acceptable and expected for those kind of qualitative considerations to come into play. Again, the best way to do that in terms of just thinking about it generally is to have had those considerations discussed and articulated beforehand. So, stating somewhere in some plan or in some policy how important each of those qualitative factors are to the mission of the business or to the company and to the stakeholders. So, it's difficult without specific context to say which particular considerations, qualitative considerations, should be factored in and how. But there are some obvious ones. Yes, the jobs in the community are is a factor that can be considered. Now, if that's part of a written policy or plan or mission statement that says, our goal is to be a long-term member of our community and to keep jobs in place, having that in place beforehand, or having that that concern evident in the general activities of the business helps in factoring those in ultimately when an offer does come in.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for answering some of these questions and for giving the presentation today. Those of you whose questions we couldn't get to, we do have them on record, and you guys can get in touch after the webinar to get those specific answers, to your questions. We're all done for today, and we're slightly over time, so I'm going to let everybody go. But thank you for spending an hour with us this morning, and thank you, Alberto, for your time and expertise.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody. See you next week.
Take care, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.